Closed captioning of this program is made possible by the Fireman's Fund Foundation.
Now, our state is only
Tonight, State Treasurer Bill Lockyer on how he plans to keep California solvent if the federal government defaults on its loans. More tough times ahead for higher education students. California State University tuition has now doubled from 2007, and University of California fees will go up almost 10%. The Citizens Redistricting Commission draws fire with its new political district lines and won't release its latest maps to the public as planned. And a look at two exhibits in San Francisco that celebrate the life of Oakland writer Gertrude Stein and her family's extraordinary art collection. Coming up next. Good evening, I'm Belva Davis, and welcome to This Week in Northern California. As the country watches President Obama and Congress debate over raising the federal debt ceiling, State Treasurer Bill Lockyer is planning ahead. I spoke with him earlier about how he intends to ensure there's enough cash for California. Treasurer Lockyer, welcome to the program. We know the problems that we're facing in Washington. But the question is, how will this affect California? What will be the impact if there's no agreement on raising the ceiling?
Well, the immediate impact, Belva, is that if the federal government has its credit rating go down, then that ripples into the credit ratings of states and municipalities all over the country, including California. There are lots of local entities that have their credit tied directly, just automatically. Whatever the federal Treasury credit rating is, they get the same thing. Now, our state is only secondarily that, but San Jose, Santa Clara, Oakland, Los Angeles, the list goes on of like 7,000 different agencies that would be impacted. So for them to borrow money, if they even can, if it doesn't freeze up, to borrow money to build a school or finish the highway or whatever could become significantly more expensive. So that's one. The second problem is if they can't get it done in Washington and there's a failure to continue to make disbursements, school money, Medicare, health money, and so on, then that creates a cash flow problem for the state of California as well as others. And it means when I have to go out and borrow about $5 billion this summer to continue to pay the bills until the better revenue months come later in the year, I can't borrow at a reasonable rate. It makes it more urgent. It might even mean we'd send out IOUs if we're not able to get to the markets because of the dislocations that are national like that. So that's the second problem. Now, the third is if they do make a deal, and if they do make a deal and it includes, trillions of dollars of budget cuts, then that might result in cash flow problems as well as individual hardships. We just had our budget adopted in California that mostly relied on spending cuts in health programs and workfare programs and other things, and schools, et cetera. Those miseries could be amplified if now there's a round of federal cuts that pile misery on top of misery.
So we hear also that could affect Social Security payments, and would that have any direct impact on California if that ended up being one of the outcomes?
Well, I'm I don't think that's likely to happen because Social Security is one of the first payouts that they make, and there's some money even though there's not enough to pay all the bills. If it continued for a long time, then eventually that gets to be problematic as well. Now, that doesn't matter directly to California other than all the individuals that maybe be impacted would perhaps, without income, have to not pay for other consumer items and so on that affects our revenues, our economy. So there's indirect impacts as well as the individual ones.
So what can you as treasurer do for California?
Do a lot of praying, I guess. But, you know, I talk to the congressional delegation. They know what the problems are and how we're trying to do our best to get the right outcome in Washington, D.C. After that, it's just, you know, I'm the banker, so I'm the one that tries to make sure there's enough money to keep the schools and other programs going.
But what can you do actively to avoid the, you know, the pinch being quite as hard as it could be?
Sure. Well, one thing I am doing right now, you know, this federal problem has an August 2nd date. And we would normally, later in August, borrow $5 billion that I had mentioned to pay the bills for schools and others in the next few months. We're trying to do a bridge loan that we would get completed before August 2nd. So if they do have some problem, we'll already have our money in the bank and can pay the bills with, and can last for a while until we're impacted.
Okay, we have just a few seconds left, but can you speak at all about the California state budget? I mean, how are we on that? Do you expect some other problems coming from our own shortage still, not quite balancing the budget?
Well, you know, our policymakers decided that they would count on an additional $4 billion in revenues out of about $88 billion. That more than was forecast, hoping the economy would pick up, and then they wouldn't have to make additional cuts in the safety net or schools or other things. So if that works out, we're in good shape. If it doesn't, another round of cuts.
Another round of cuts.
Yeah.
All right, Treasurer Lockyer, thank you for bringing, I'm not sure,
all of this great cheer, yeah.
all this great news to us. Thank you. Well, there was some good news. If Treasurer Lockyer does borrow, there's good news from Wall Street. The rate for California will be the lowest it's been in years. And joining me now to discuss redistricting and higher education tuition going up are Lisa Vorderbruggen, political editor with the Contra Costa Times, and Nanette Azovoff, education writer with the San Francisco Chronicle. Nanette, we'll start with you. What we seem to have is the worst possible outcome. What happened this week?
Well, yet again, both the California State University and the University of California have raised tuition, and not by a little amount, by quite a lot. It was 9.6% for University of California, but that was on top of another one, an 8% already approved for this year. So now students are going to be paying more than $13,000 for a year at UC. This is a university that was really supposed to be free. California State University will be paying about $6,500. This is all before room and board. And they did it in the middle of the summer, so we did not see the kind of protests that we've come to know for the past couple of years with students occupying buildings. It was relatively quiet.
And listening to the treasurer there, it seems as though this could get much worse.
You're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that the regents and the CSU trustees warned of is mid-year cuts. So if the state does not get revenues that they anticipate, both of the universities say that they will raise tuition again, and perhaps, you know, just an automatic trigger of maybe 5.5% more. I mean, I think that the students really need to start expecting what they've seen is annual raises, and they're really angry about it. And they just, what they tell me is that their family income isn't going up, and tuition is. So they're very angry.
Isn't this a function of sort of shared sacrifice? I mean, there's been cuts everywhere in so many things. I mean, why shouldn't college students be expected to? I mean, I know they're not bearing the full cost of the shortfall.
It's a great question, and it's easy in a sense to put it onto students because they're able to pay, in a sense. They're a source of funding. But what is being argued is that the California State University systems are jewels, really crown jewels of this state. And so you see other areas going down. What was named yesterday was the foster system, the prison system. Everything is feeling the crunch of this horrible economic times. But the university systems are still economic engines. They produce research and development and products, and they're really a jewel of California. And you see the trustees saying, we're going to ruin it all. You know, all the cuts.
What about cutting in other areas other than just increasing fees for students?
Well, it's true that the tuition only takes care of about a quarter of the deficits that these universities see. So both universities talk about all the cuts that are going on in their campuses. So we see layoffs, we see course sections cut back. The chancellors at the Regents meeting this week were talking about how the morale is down and there's long lines for courses. So it's coming on both ends, and students feel it, and they're really mad.
Now, Lieutenant Governor Gavin Newsom was the only no vote on these tuition. Was he just sort of making this empty political statement?
Well,
or, I mean, I heard one of his critics call him irresponsible for the vote.
He and the student trustees, but also voted. Oh. But it's somebody said yesterday.
I think there were a couple of others, weren't there also?
There were
George Marcus.
George Marcus, that's right,
yes.
And one other person. But they, the lieutenant governors always vote no because they can, and so.
The other big controversy was over the salary of presidents in the system, and the big raise that one got in San Diego.
Exactly.
How did that all come about at the same time?
It was amazing because even as the trustees are raising and the regents are raising the fees, UC San Diego, CSU San Diego campus president got a huge raise, and in the UC system, Mark Larrett of the UCSF got about $1 million raise, but that's not from state fund, but others did get very hefty funds paid for by the state. Now, why they do this is that they say, well, these people have worked harder, and they've taken on new responsibilities. And when you say that, well, the lower paid workers say, well, haven't we?
Well, and in the market, I mean, these individuals, in theory, could go somewhere else and the system would lose them, right? Isn't that the argument they make?
A Harvard University headhunter came knocking on the door of Mark Larrett, who is the CEO of the medical center at UCSF. And that was the justification for saying, oh, well, if the headhunter knocked on your door, we don't want you to. And they can't have him leave because he's in the middle of some major projects.
Can anybody make them rescind these increases?
It's
the governor, I understand,
is trying, and another assemblyman has sent a letter to UC President Mark Yudof asking for rescinding. I think you will not see that happening. No.
Okay. One controversy, we moved from that to yet another, and that's about where you draw the lines for the districts that our representatives will have to work hard to get elected to. Lisa, tell us about that.
Well, as we may or may not know, once a decade after the census, we redraw our political maps in order to get one person, one vote. So the Senate, legislative, and congressional seats are all up for redrawing. And this time around, our voters decided to have a grand experiment in California and have an independent citizens redistricting commission draw those lines instead of a partisan-controlled legislature. And boy, has it been interesting, because now we're seeing laid out in public in all of these hours and hours and hours of meetings and maps exactly how the sausage is made. And I think that people, it comes a little bit under the guise of be careful what you ask for, because now you're seeing real live what those conflicts are, and so many people are so mad that it may end up being the ultimate perfect compromise and that no one is happy with the outcome.
But now the commission, I guess, whether clearly understood or not, has broken a promise of revealing these maps
well,
about
you know,
now.
that is a matter of interpretation that I don't agree with myself, because what the commission did was they initially set up a schedule in which they would release 2 rounds of draft maps before they released their final maps. They canceled the second draft maps in lieu of doing an ongoing sort of rolling out of the internet maps so that they could keep working on the final maps, because they're running out of time. But all of these meetings are on the internet. You could watch hours and hours of blow by blow, and all of the maps are online for you to see. The only thing they didn't do was sort of put out a package of all of sort of this interim set of maps that would go out, and then they would get response to those. But they're continuing to take public comment. They're continuing to roll these maps out. You can go on to wedrawthelines.org at this very moment and pull up more maps than you could ever possibly want.
But how different are they from what we had? Are we going to see some wholly different political landscape?
We're going to see a wholesale change in the landscape, you know, in California, because the previous lines were drawn to protect the incumbents of both parties. There was an unholy alliance. They cut a deal so that all of the incumbents would get reelected, and they almost all of them did, with the exception of one in the last decade. So now you have districts that are being drawn based on city boundaries, communities of interest, geographic constraints. You don't have long arms of things crossing over to pick up a little population of Democrats to get the numbers right.
We used to call that gerrymandering.
Yeah, gerrymandering. People remember what that is. And so that's going away. And now what we're having is this pitched battle between the various communities of interest and ethnic groups, racial groups that want to protect their voting clout. And when they want to be able to elect their representatives to Congress, be you Latino, African American, the gay and lesbian community has their maps out. Everybody's got maps. And
but what it all comes down to is it going to remain a Democratic state? Is it going to be more Republican? Who wins, who loses here?
Well, we're absolutely going to remain a Democratic state based on registration. And most of the analysis of the first draft of maps that came out, now keep in mind they've been rolling along with changes, that the Democrats were expected to potentially gain some seats. There's a lot of talk that the Democrats will get the 2/3 that they need in the legislature to avoid having any kind of block by the Republicans for a budget. And the Democrats very much want that. But it will probably be a function of this is where people live and how the lines come out. The commission, in theory, is not drawing those lines specifically to make that happen.
Let's talk about Fremont, where the population there, the Indian population there, had some very strong objections. And also, what are these Voting Rights Act cities, counties, or areas that they're concerned about?
Well, the Federal Voting Rights Act trumps everything else that goes on in mapping. And what it says is that if you are a minority population, they cannot draw lines to dilute your voting power. So you cannot take a whole community of African Americans and split them into 15 pieces to keep any African American from getting elected. And we have a half dozen counties, fewer than that, in the state of California that are official Voting Rights Act counties. In other words, they've had violations in the past, and the feds require pre-approval of that area before their maps can go forward. So, so those areas are one thing, but even in LA County, we've seen this huge push between the Latino community and the African American community. African American community numbers have declined, but they have 3 congressional representatives now. The Latino communities say they should get more, and so you have the Citizens Commission, these amateurs, they're not exactly volunteers, they're getting paid, but who have never done this before, trying to balance out all of these competing interests.
In the end, when will we see the maps?
August 1st will be the final maps. There'll be a 14-day review period. They have till August 15th to adopt them, and then we'll see whether we go to court or go back to the ballot or have a referendum. It's all going to be wild. So,
well, away from the problems for a moment, we're going to turn to art. 2 San Francisco museums are currently showcasing the life of legendary Oakland writer Gertrude Stein and the incredible art collected by her family while living in Paris in the early 1900s. PBS's NewsHour correspondent Spencer Michaels has the story.
In turn-of-the-century Paris, the American writer Gertrude Stein held court for avant-garde painters and writers at the home she shared with her brothers and sister-in-law. She had been raised in Oakland, then went to Baltimore, but Paris was where the art scene was. Century-old photographs of their apartments show the walls nearly hidden by paintings of Picasso and Matisse and others the family had bought cheaply. a collection that was dispersed over the years. Today, that amazing assemblage of groundbreaking art has been reassembled at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art.
The exhibition brings together over 150 pieces that were once owned by the Steins from 5 different continents, from public collections, from private collections, really from all over the world.
Janet Bishop, one of the show's curators, said this wasn't just any art collection. Stein scoured art galleries and shows buying paintings by unheralded artists like Pierre Bonnard, Paul Cézanne, Juan Gris, as well as Picasso and Matisse, the cutting-edge artists of the day whose work, not yet famous nor expensive, gave rise to Fauvism, Cubism, and Surrealism.
The Steins were really essential to the development of modern art in the early 20th century. Their homes became the crossroads for dialogue, and anyone who was interested in seeing the most interesting new art being made in Paris at the time really had to go to the Stein residences.
For years, Bishop and others tracked down the collection and convinced current owners to part with their treasures for exhibition here, then in Paris, and finally next February in New York. A very expensive journey. In San Francisco, the paintings were examined minutely on arrival for pre-existing faults or flaws. In the museum's conservation room, some of the work received a little touching up, a little cleaning, the removal of old varnish, perhaps some reframing, everybody being very careful. The Steins were not wealthy art patrons. They had a modest inheritance from a father who had operated cable cars in San Francisco, and they spent most of it on paintings and sculpture destined to become extremely valuable.
Gertrude Stein famously said, you can buy art or you can buy clothes, but you couldn't do both. So the Steins decided to focus on artists who were their peers, artists who had not yet made their reputations.
Henri Matisse was a family favorite. In 1906, Gertrude Stein and her brother Leo saw this Matisse at a Paris salon, unsold.
Leo and Gertrude Stein stepped forward at the very end of the exhibition and offered Matisse a discounted price, and he accepted it. And as soon as that painting got to their home on the Rue de Fleurus, people needed to go see it. It had been the most notorious submission to that year's salon.
Notorious because even Matisse's wife, who was the model, was embarrassed by the colors that didn't correspond to nature.
It was one thing to do that with landscape, but then to take that palette and apply it to a portrait of a woman, to a woman's face, to paint a woman's face green. It was utterly shocking and unprecedented.
The painting, Woman with a Hat, is today regarded as a masterpiece and graces the cover of the catalog.
The Stein sculptures and pictures at San Francisco MoMA would be worthy of a show even if it weren't for the Steins. But the Steins, of course, give a lot of added interest. Across the street at the Contemporary Jewish Museum, they've mounted a companion show on the life of Gertrude Stein.
These are 2 drawings by David Levine, Gertrude Stein here.
As a character, Stein was a fascinating study, and Wanda Korn, art professor emeritus at Stanford and guest curator of this Stein show, has delved into her life and her friends.
Many of her friendships, it need be said, were rather short-lived because she would quickly move on to another interest, another artist, another project that she was taking on.
One friend she did keep was her companion, Alice B. Toklas, a major feature of this exhibit.
Gertrude and Alice fell in love, and eventually Alice moved into the apartment of Leo and Gertrude. And it was Gertrude who continued to bring artists into the home.
But Gertrude Stein wanted to be more than a collector.
She liked collecting, but after a while, her public image as a patron and a collector bothered her. She wanted to be known the same way Picasso was known, for her creative work, not just for her collecting of others.
Stein thought of herself primarily as a writer, whose work, Korn contends, has come back into fashion.
She was always just a little outside the mainstream. until really feminism rediscovered her and began to look at her through a completely different lens.
In addition to writing several books, including the best-selling autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, Stein composed the libretto for a cutting-edge opera composed by Virgil Thompson, Four Saints in 3 acts, with an all-black cast, produced in 1934. Both museums are showing excerpts. As a writer and a collector, Gertrude was a very strong personality who encouraged her own celebrity and loved being painted and sculpted. Perhaps the most famous portrait is by Picasso, which both museums are featuring in different forms.
Gertrude tells this wonderful story of having sat in Picasso's studio for some 80 or 90 sittings in a broken armchair. Then at one point he got completely fed up. He went off to the Pyrenees for the summer, and when he got back to his studio in Paris, he repainted the head completely and made her very mask-like. And that really was a fundamental step toward Cubism.
Wanting to ensure her own legacy, Stein left the Picasso portrait to the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art, the only painting she willed to a museum.
Well, both exhibits run through September the 6th. And there is a Stein slideshow and arts review at kqed.org/thisweek. Plus, you can read about the latest advances in AIDS drugs developed by a Bay Area company. Well, my thanks to both of you for joining us here tonight. And thank you for watching. I'm Belva Davis. Good night.